August 21st, 1942. The banks of the Ilu River, Guadalcanal. Night. The jungle breathes in silence, the air thick with rot and rain. Beneath a dripping canopy, hundreds of Japanese infantry crouch low, bayonets fixed, whispering prayers to the emperor. Their faces are painted in mud, their rifles wrapped in rags to muffle sound. Ahead lies the American perimeter, a line of foxholes and barbed wire around Henderson Field. A hand signal passes down the line. The order comes in a hiss. Advance. The jungle erupts. Men rise from the darkness shouting, "Banzai!" as they charge through mud and brush, rifles gleaming in the flare light. They expect surprise, panic, confusion. Instead, flares burst overhead, white daylight tearing open the night. A heartbeat later, the air fills with the staccato roar of 50 caliber Brownings and the dull, rhythmic thump of 81 mm mortars. The jungle floor turns to smoke and fire. Entire ranks vanish in seconds, torn apart before reaching the wire. Grenades fall like rain. Machine guns sweep from flank to flank until the screams stop. In less than 10 minutes, the charge that began with 1,000 voices ends in silence, and for the first time, the Japanese army meets the future. Not courage, but calculated firepower. When the Japanese army invaded the Pacific in 1941, it brought with it not only battle-hardened men but a belief that courage could overcome firepower. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Army had cultivated a doctrine of moral supremacy, a conviction born from centuries of samurai tradition and refined through modern wars in Manchuria and China. The soldier was taught that spirit, seishin, was stronger than steel. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, night bayonet assaults had carried Port Arthur's forts. In China, massed infantry had overwhelmed nationalist lines by sheer momentum. Each victory reinforced a dangerous myth that the Japanese soldier, disciplined and fearless, could close the distance before an enemy could reload. The bayonet charge was more than a tactic. It was ritual. A moment where courage could prove divine right. When Japan turned its gaze south toward the islands of the Pacific, that mindset followed. At the war's outset, it worked. British and Dutch garrisons crumbled under shock attacks. Philippine outposts fell before relentless infantry waves supported by light artillery. Against demoralized colonial forces, the Banzai charge still had meaning. But on Guadalcanal, that faith met an enemy that did not break. In August 1942, U.S. Marines seized the unfinished Japanese airfield on the north coast of the island. They named it Henderson Field. To Japan's high command, this was intolerable. The first serious challenge to imperial expansion. Reinforcements landed within days, commanded by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a veteran of the China campaigns. His men were elite, nearly 900 from the 28th Infantry Regiment, armed with Arisaka rifles, light machine guns, and bayonets polished to mirror shine. They had been told the enemy numbered only a few hundred. At dawn on August 21st, Ichiki's force attacked the marine perimeter along the Ilu River, later misnamed the Tanaru. They advanced in perfect discipline, line after line moving through the surf, shouting, "Banzai!" into the night. The first wave reached the barbed wire and vanished. The Americans were waiting with interlocking machine gun fields, pre-sighted 81 mm mortar tubes, and belt-fed 50 caliber Brownings positioned along the sand. The result was annihilation. The Browning M2 50 caliber was more than a machine gun. It was a doctrine in steel. Designed by John Browning in 1918, the weapon fired a 700-grain bullet at nearly 2,900 feet per second, heavy enough to punch through palm trunks, helmets, and bone alike. Mounted on tripods and sandbag nests, the Marines used it not for suppression, but extermination. At 600 rounds per minute, each gun swept 50-yard arcs, cutting down waves of men before they could reload. Behind them, the 81 mm M1 mortar spoke with a steady rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Each crew could drop up to 18 rounds a minute, blanketing entire approach routes. The high-explosive shells detonated with sharp concussions, showering metal fragments across the riverbank. The Japanese soldiers who tried to crawl forward found themselves shredded by fragments they never saw. By sunrise, Ichiki's regiment was gone. Of his 917 men, only 128 made it back to Japanese lines. The rest lay along the sandbars and in the shallows, their bayonets still clutched in their hands. For the Marines, the victory was brutal but decisive. For the Japanese, it was unthinkable. An entire elite battalion, destroyed in hours, not by superior numbers but by the precise, methodical application of mortars and heavy machine guns. And yet, even after Guadalcanal, Tokyo refused to abandon the charge. Officers called it an isolated failure, blaming faulty reconnaissance, not flawed doctrine. The myth of spirit over steel endured, carried forward to Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan, where it would meet the same fate again and again under the same merciless rhythm of American fire. The Pacific was becoming a testing ground. Courage versus calculation, and on every island the outcome would be the same. The Tanaru was only the beginning. In the months that followed, the Japanese army kept returning to the same idea, that if courage was pure enough, firepower could be outlasted. Across the Pacific, that conviction died one battle at a time. To understand why, one must see how the American defensive machine evolved. In 1942, most Marine and Army infantry units were still learning jungle warfare. Communication was limited, supply chains stretched, and the terrain was brutal. Rain-soaked ridges, tangled canopies, and mud so deep it swallowed boots. Yet the Americans adapted faster than their enemies expected. Central to that adaptation were two tools, the 81 mm mortar and the 50 caliber Browning. Both had existed before the war, but Guadalcanal revealed their potential when combined. The M1 81 Mepu Inmebaditi mortar, weighing about 130 pounds in total with baseplate and bipod, could lob a 6.5-pound shell nearly 3 yards. It was light enough to move with the infantry, but powerful enough to shatter bunkers and break massed attacks. The weapon's simplicity was its strength. 3 men, a sighting quadrant, and muscle memory. Drop a round, listen for the thud, adjust elevation by degrees. The crews learned to fire by sound, counting the rhythm between drops, letting instinct take over. In darkness or rain, they could maintain a perfect barrage without ever seeing the target. Beside them, the Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun became the heartbeat of every Marine perimeter. Its heavy slugs tore through trees, sandbags, and flesh alike. At close range, the impact of a 50 cal could sever limbs, detonate ammunition pouches, or punch through light armor. Mounted on tripods or half-tracks, the M2's water-jacketed barrels glowed red in the night as gunners fired in short, precise bursts to conserve ammo. Its long-range authority and psychological effect were devastating. Even the sound was enough to freeze movement in the jungle. When American lines faced an assault, these two weapons spoke in tandem. The mortars blanketed the approach routes, forcing attackers into the open. The 50 cals waited for them there. The coordination was mathematical. Pre-registered firing tables calculated every likely approach. By late 1943, most Marine battalions had trained to overlay mortar arcs and machine gun sweeps so that no corridor of approach was uncovered. The Japanese never developed an effective answer. Their light mortars, the 50 mm knee mortar, were excellent for harassment but useless against entrenched positions. Their heaviest support weapons were 70 mm battalion guns and a handful of 37 mm infantry pieces, most of which had to be man-hauled through jungle mud. Against American emplacements reinforced with barbed wire, sandbags, and interlocking fields of fire, they had little chance. But the real gulf wasn't hardware. It was philosophy. Japanese officers still measured success by offensive spirit, not logistics. Soldiers were taught to seek death as proof of loyalty. Survival was secondary. Many charged without artillery preparation or coordination, trusting in speed and terror. In China, against disorganized opponents, it had worked. In the Pacific, it was suicide. By 1943, American positions across the Solomons, at Edson's Ridge, Cape Gloucester, and Bougainville were built around a single principle: make them come, then make them disappear. After the war, Japanese veterans would recall the psychological shock of those nights. One survivor from the 2nd Division wrote, "We charged, shouting, 'Banzai!' but the enemy was not there. Only light and thunder. The ground exploded. I saw men lifted and torn apart by invisible shells." Another described the fire of the 50 calibers. "It was not like bullets. It was a blade that cut through the air. Even so, commanders kept ordering the charges. Pride and ideology demanded them. To retreat was dishonor. To die charging was proof of worth. The Americans, grim but efficient, learned to expect it. They could hear the chants before they saw the faces. They would tighten their grips on the triggers, wait for the flares, and then answer with mathematics. And with every island, the lesson deepened. Courage, no matter how pure, could not survive geometry." By the middle of the Pacific Campaign, the U.S. approach to defense and fire control had evolved into a science. What had begun as improvisation on Guadalcanal became, by 1944, a near-perfect choreography of sightlines, trajectories, and timing. At the heart of this system was the coordination between mortars and machine guns, weapons that complemented each other in both reach and rhythm. To Japanese infantrymen taught to close the distance and fight with the bayonet, it was like charging into an invisible web. American positions were built on math. Before the first shot of any engagement, Marines and soldiers pre-registered their 81 Ninukwat mortar tubes for every likely approach route. Each tube's baseplate was anchored and mapped. Elevation, range, and charge data were calculated in advance and logged on waterproof cards. The moment enemy movement was detected, by trip flares, scouts, or sound, gunners didn't guess. They simply read off numbers and fired. The effect was terrifying precision. Even at night, mortar rounds landed within yards of expected paths. The first volley shattered formations. The second blocked retreat. Few Japanese units ever reached the wire intact. The 50 caliber Browning, meanwhile, formed the fixed spine of these positions. Each gun was assigned a sector of fire that overlapped the next, ensuring continuous coverage. Crossfire zones, deliberately overlapping arcs, created kill funnels where attackers could not escape. American gunners trained to traverse slowly, walking their fire from flank to flank. At 2,900 feet per second, each bullet could travel over 2 miles. At 600 rounds per minute, the sound alone could drown thought. At night, the battlefield became a machine of rhythm and light, flares rising, mortars thumping, machine guns hammering in overlapping cadence. Japanese veterans later described it as iron rain. The Japanese possessed courage. The Americans possessed industry. The difference was logistical gravity, the ability to sustain violence indefinitely. Each mortar platoon carried thousands of rounds stacked in waterproof tins, with additional supply lines feeding from the beachhead. The weapon's simplicity allowed constant operation. A misfire was rare. A barrel change took seconds, and new baseplates could be fabricated in the field. In contrast, Japanese infantry relied on lighter 50mm knee mortars, effective at short range but incapable of area denial. Their heavy weapons were too few and too immobile to respond. When faced with 81mm saturation fire, they had no counter. The Browning M2, likewise, symbolized an industrial scale of warfare the Japanese could not match. Its parts were interchangeable. Barrels and springs arrived in crates. Belts came by the thousands. In every battle zone, from Guadalcanal to Tarawa, armorers could replace worn barrels, assemble new tripods, and have the guns firing again within hours. Japanese infantry, by contrast, depended on the Type 96 light machine gun, reliable but underpowered, and the Type 3 heavy machine gun, which required water cooling and was too heavy for mobile assault. Against the Browning's brute velocity, both were outclassed. To the Japanese, the most demoralizing factor wasn't just the volume of American fire, it was its consistency. The mortars never missed. The machine guns never jammed. The Americans never ran out of ammunition. In Japanese field diaries recovered from Bougainville and Saipan, recurring phrases appear. The fire never stops. The sound continues. It is like the island itself is shooting. To a culture steeped in the romanticism of personal valor, this was soul-crushing. Battles no longer hinged on willpower. They were decided by mathematics, by trajectories plotted on paper hours before the enemy arrived. American platoon leaders turned fire control into doctrine. Patrols would set trip flares at measured intervals. Listening posts reported enemy movement by compass bearing and estimated distance. Mortar crews translated that into elevation and charge tables. The first illumination rounds were fired not to aim, but to expose, lighting the jungle so machine gunners could pick targets instantly. By 1944, many mortar units could deliver fire for effect within 60 seconds of detection. The average charge that once took minutes to respond now drew instant, coordinated response. Every hill became a pre-planned kill zone, every ravine a mapped grid. Even when the Japanese adapted, attacking at night or through swamp, the rhythm didn't change. The Americans simply adjusted. The sound of a single twig snapping might be followed by a dozen. Mortar tubes firing in unison, U.S. Army. Research after the war estimated that mortars and machine guns accounted for over 2/3 of Japanese combat deaths in the Central and South Pacific campaigns. At Tarawa alone, Marine mortars fired nearly 30,000 rounds in 3 days. At Peleliu, 50 cows on landing craft tore apart counterattacks before they reached the beach. For every Japanese rifleman charging forward, there were hundreds of American rounds already inbound. Unseen, unheard, and inevitable. It wasn't personal bravery that decided those nights, it was preparation, and when courage met calculus, courage died first. For the men who fought in those jungles, the Pacific War wasn't abstract. It was close, physical, and often personal. The ground between opposing lines might be no more than 50 yards. The jungle was so thick that visibility rarely exceeded 20. Yet, in those narrow spaces, technology turned human courage into statistics. Japanese infantry entered battle under a code that blended faith, nationalism, and fatalism. Every soldier carried a copy of the Senjin-kun, the field service code, which demanded death before surrender. A man's worth was measured not by survival, but by sacrifice. To die charging the enemy was not failure, it was purification. The doctrine was simple. 1 man's spirit equals 10 men's fire. Against that belief stood an American force that had learned to survive by efficiency. Marines and soldiers no longer saw charges as heroic, only suicidal. By 1943, frontline units were taught to stay calm, calculate ranges, and trust their weapons. Let the guns do the work, their sergeants said. Courage meant not panicking when hundreds came running through the dark. The result was a psychological inversion. To the Japanese, battle began with emotion, with shouting, momentum, and faith. To the Americans, it began with silence and ended in rhythm. Each man in a foxhole had his task memorized. Who fired illumination? Who adjusted mortars? Who traversed the Brownings? Who reloaded? When the shouting started, there was no fear left, only procedure. Veterans would later describe it not as fighting, but as enduring the storm. One Marine at Henderson Field remembered, "You didn't think about who they were. You thought about the next belt, the next tube, the next flare. You didn't stop until the noise stopped." Private Harold Zuber of the 1st Marine Division wrote in his diary after Guadalcanal, "They came in waves, screaming and shining in the flares. I saw them fall like wheat. I thought it would never stop. My hands burned from the barrel heat. When morning came, there was nothing moving." Another Marine mortar man recalled Bougainville in 1943. "We had the tubes laid out across the ravine. They walked straight into it. We fired as fast as we could drop them. Some were so close we could hear them crying before they disappeared. For Japanese survivors, the experience was equally haunting. Corporal Shoichi Yamamoto, one of the few to survive the Edson's Ridge assault, later said, "We ran into fire that came from everywhere. It was not men shooting. It was the jungle itself. Their courage had been absolute. Their defeat was mechanical." For years, the Japanese High Command believed that Western soldiers lacked the will for close combat. The early victories in Malaya and the Philippines seemed to prove it. But on the volcanic slopes of the Solomons, that myth disintegrated. The Americans were not weak. They were methodical, and their weapons had no fear. At Edson's Ridge, 3,000 Japanese troops charged against 830 Marines. They came with bayonets and grenades. The Marines replied with mortars and 50 cals. By dawn, more than 1,200 Japanese lay dead around the perimeter. The ridge was carpeted in bodies so dense that bulldozers had to clear them. At Bougainville, the pattern repeated. At Tarawa, Peleliu, and finally Saipan, it became a ritual. Each night attack ended the same way. The jungle flashed white, machine guns roared, mortars thumped, and silence followed. By 1944, American intelligence officers reported a strange shift. Fewer Japanese charges, more nighttime infiltration, more use of caves and bunkers. The doctrine of the Banzai charge, once the pride of the Imperial Army, was dying, replaced by a grim acceptance of static defense. It wasn't an evolution born of strategy. It was survival. For the Americans, victory carried its own weight. Many Marines spoke of pity after the slaughter. Sergeant William Carney of the 27th Infantry recalled Saipan. "You start shooting because you have to, but after a while it's like mowing a field. You stop feeling. You just want it to end." Others confessed that the endless charges left them hollow. "You can't cheer when it's that easy," one gunner said. "You just reload." For the Japanese, the defeat was spiritual. Officers who survived often chose suicide. One diary found at Saipan ended with the line, "The Emperor's soldiers met the devil in the jungle, and the devil had infinite bullets." This clash, faith versus firepower, defined the Pacific Theater's emotional landscape. The Americans didn't celebrate those victories. They endured them. The Japanese didn't lose through cowardice. They lost to physics. And the weapons that shaped that truth, the 81mm mortar and the 50 caliber Browning, became the instruments of an age where technology no longer just supported courage. It replaced it. The age of the charge was over. The age of calculation had begun. September 12, 1942, Guadalcanal. The island smelled of mud, mildew, and death. For weeks, U.S. Marines had held the thin defensive line around Henderson Field against constant sniping and probing attacks. The nights were long and sleepless, the kind of darkness where every rustle sounded like an army. The men had learned to live half buried in foxholes, rifles within reach, fingers always on the trigger. That night, the wind shifted. The jungle went silent, and then it began. 3,000 men from the Kawaguchi detachment moved through the trees, their faces painted black, bayonets fixed. Colonel Kiyonao Kawaguchi, who had replaced Ichiki after the disaster at the Tanaru, believed his men could succeed where others had failed. The Americans were exhausted, he argued, stretched thin and outnumbered. The Japanese would strike in darkness, climb Edson's Ridge, and seize the airfield in one furious night. As the first wave advanced up the slopes, they moved quietly, stepping over their dead from earlier skirmishes. Above them, the Marines of Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and the Paramarines waited. 830 men stretched across a ridge barely 2,000 yards long. They had no fortifications, only foxholes scraped into red clay. Their artillery was too far to help. All they had were their mortars, machine guns, and nerves. At 9:30 p.m., the jungle erupted. Flares arced skyward, turning the ridge into an island of white light amid the darkness. Within seconds, the Marines' 81mm mortars opened up, walking fire down the slope in steady rhythm. The Japanese advanced anyway, shouting "Banzai!" as they charged uphill into the explosions. From the ridge crest, 50 caliber Brownings opened fire, lines of orange tracers tearing through the jungle. Men were lifted off the ground, torn apart mid-step, or simply vanished into the mud. Still the waves came. The machine guns overheated. Crews swapped barrels and kept firing. Mortar teams worked bare-handed, dropping shell after shell until the barrels glowed red. By midnight, the slope below looked like a furnace. Trees were splintered, leaves shredded by shrapnel, and the ground slick with mud and blood. Entire Japanese platoons disappeared under the bombardment. Those who reached the wire found it covered by crossfire. Every approach zeroed in advance. The Marines fought by instinct. When mortars ran low, they fired rifles and threw grenades until the tubes were resupplied. The 50 cowgunners rotated every 10 minutes to keep their arms from seizing. Every few minutes a new flare illuminated the horror below, bodies piled in heaps, bayonets glinting in the light, smoke drifting through the palms. Colonel Edson moved along the line, shouting encouragement, though most men couldn't hear him over the noise. "Hold your fire until you see them," he yelled. "Make every round count." At one point, Japanese troops broke through a weak spot near the ridge's center. For half an hour it was hand-to-hand, knives, rifle butts, bayonets in the dark. When the sun rose, 50 dead Marines lay beside hundreds of Japanese. The battle raged for nearly 12 hours. When it ended, Kawaguchi's detachment ceased to exist. Of the 3,000 men who had begun the assault, fewer than 500 returned to their lines. The ridge itself was a slaughterhouse. Trees stripped bare, earth cratered by mortars, and corpses stacked so densely that the Marines could walk from one end of the slope to the other without touching the ground. Reporters who arrived days later described a silence that felt unnatural. One wrote, "It was as though the island itself had been burned hollow." For the Japanese, the defeat was catastrophic and incomprehensible. Kawaguchi's men had fought with absolute bravery. They had done everything doctrine demanded: surprise, momentum, spiritual will. Yet they were destroyed in a single night by an enemy that never even counterattacked. For the Americans, Edson's Ridge became legend. It was the moment they realized the balance of power in the Pacific was changing. The Marines had stood their ground against an elite Japanese force and prevailed, not through superior numbers, but through precision, control, and endurance. In post-battle reports, the Marines recorded firing over 5,600 mortar rounds and nearly 200,000 machine gun rounds during the fight. Every yard of the slope was charted in fire. When dawn came, the ridge smoked like a dying volcano. The air was heavy with the stench of burned powder and blood. Marines stared down at the carnage in disbelief and pity. "They just kept coming," one said softly. "They never had a chance." That night on Guadalcanal became more than a battle. It was the moment when a centuries-old belief that courage could conquer anything died in the rain. June 1944, Saipan. The island burned beneath the midday sun. For 3 weeks, American Marines and Army troops had fought yard by yard through cane fields, coral ridges, and shattered villages. The Japanese defenders, nearly 30,000 strong, had fought with grim tenacity. Every cave, every trench, every building contested. Yet by the end of June they were trapped. Ammunition was gone. Food had run out. The sea was cut off. The surviving Japanese soldiers, remnants of the 43rd Division and naval troops, gathered under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. Among them were civilians, medics, and wounded men who could barely walk. Saito knew the end had come. American artillery and carrier aircraft had pounded his lines into dust. The Imperial Navy could no longer reach Saipan. Surrender was unthinkable. So he issued his final order: "We will advance to attack the enemy and die an honorable death." At dawn on July 7th, nearly 4,000 Japanese soldiers, the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War, formed a line across the hills north of Tanapag. Many had no rifles. Some carried swords, spears, or sticks of dynamite. Medics and walking wounded joined them. Saito's adjutant shouted the emperor's name, and the line began to move. The sound carried through the valley, a human roar rising above the surf and the palm trees. Marines of the 27th Infantry Division heard it first, a low hum that grew into thunder. Seconds later, hundreds of figures appeared through the smoke, screaming and waving banners. The Americans were stunned by the sight. For a moment, they thought it was a retreat. Then the first shots came. The line crashed into their forward positions like a tide, but the Americans were not unprepared. Mortar crews had pre-registered every approach. Machine guns were already zeroed. The moment the charge reached open ground, the valley lit up like lightning. Emmet mortars began firing in ripple sequence. 6 tubes per battery, 20 rounds a minute. Explosions tore through the charging masses. Still, the survivors came, stumbling over the fallen, bayonets fixed, shouting, "Tenno Heika Banzai!" Then the 50 calibers opened up. Mounted on half-tracks and sandbag nests, they fired in sweeping arcs, cutting through ranks of men like a scythe. Gunners aimed low, turning the field into a maelstrom of dust, smoke, and bodies. Even when belts ran dry, replacements slapped new ammunition in and kept firing. For 15 minutes, the battle was chaos. Japanese soldiers broke through the first line, overrunning foxholes with bayonets and grenades. Marines fought back with pistols, entrenching tools, even fists. Entire mortar squads were killed before others filled their places. A lieutenant later said, "You could not tell where the front was. It was everywhere." But by 10 a.m., the counterfire had become absolute. Mortar sections shifted to rapid fire mode, their tubes glowing white-hot. The air was a continuous roar, the jungle canopy shredded by blasts. The few Japanese who reached the rear were gunned down by trucks mounting twin Brownings. The ground trembled under the weight of continuous fire. By noon, the attack had ended. When silence finally returned, the Marines stepped out of their holes to a sight beyond comprehension. The valley was carpeted with bodies, thousands of them, stretched as far as the eye could see. Some lay in clusters around machine gun emplacements, others scattered where mortars had landed. One section of the 105th Infantry counted 1,200 enemy dead within 100 yards of their line. In a single morning, an entire division had ceased to exist. The survivors among the Americans were shaken. Private Robert Coates of the 27th Division later wrote, "It stopped being war for a while. It was just killing. They ran straight into the guns until none were left." General Saito committed suicide that same day. His final message, later recovered from his cave, read, "The fate of the Empire rests on the shoulders of every man here. We die for our emperor." But his army had not died for victory. It had died to prove a principle that no longer belonged in modern war. The Battle of Saipan ended with over 22,000 Japanese dead, including the last great Banzai charge of the war. From that moment forward, Japanese commanders stopped ordering massed infantry assaults. They turned instead to caves, tunnels, and suicide tactics, a desperate acceptance that spirit could no longer conquer steel. For the Americans who witnessed Saipan, it was the ultimate expression of what Guadalcanal had foretold, that the Pacific War had become a conflict not between men, but between eras, one armed with faith, the other with mathematics. The 81mm mortar and the 50 caliber machine gun, once just tools, had become symbols of a new truth. In minutes, they could erase battalions that had spent generations believing courage could defy physics. When the guns finally fell silent on Saipan, the battlefield told the story more clearly than any report ever could. The ground itself looked changed, blackened by explosions, covered in the gray powder of pulverized coral and flesh. American medics moved among the wreckage, but there were few wounded to find. The Japanese charge had not ended in retreat or surrender. It had ended in extinction. That morning marked a turning point not only in the Pacific Campaign but in the entire psychology of modern war. The Japanese army, once convinced that Seishin, the purity of spirit, could overcome any weapon had met the full weight of industrial precision. And it had broken. After Saipan, no Japanese commander would again order a massed banzai assault in open terrain. The lesson had been learned in blood. Courage, no matter how boundless, could not cross open ground faster than a mortar's flight time. From that point onward, Japan's defense shifted underground, into bunkers, tunnels, and caves where artillery could not see. The suicidal fury that once powered frontal assaults now turned inward, reborn as the kamikaze. American field reports following Saipan reflected a mix of awe, exhaustion, and disbelief. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien of the 105th Infantry, who died fighting in the charge, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His last words to his men were recorded as, "Don't let them through." They didn't. Behind the courage and chaos, the numbers told a colder truth. In one night at Edson's Ridge, 830 Marines had killed more than 200 attackers. At Saipan, 4,000 Japanese soldiers had perished in under an hour. Across the Pacific, casualty ratios reached 10 to 1, a figure unseen in modern warfare. The simple equation of the 81mm mortar and the 50 caliber Browning had rewritten the cost of offense. American analysts began to quantify what they were witnessing. Reports from the Army's Operations Research Section noted that mortars accounted for nearly half of all Japanese combat deaths in late-war island battles. The rest came from machine gun fire and artillery. Rifle fire, once the measure of a soldier's skill, was a statistical footnote. The individual had disappeared inside the mechanism of coordinated fire. For U.S. forces, these weapons had become extensions of their doctrine. Infantry companies carried integrated mortar platoons. Every defensive perimeter was drawn first in arcs of fire, then in lines on a map. The experience of Guadalcanal and Saipan hardened into military geometry. Future attacks on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would follow that same blueprint. Math as method, discipline as defense. For the Japanese, the shift was existential. Survivors who retreated to new islands spoke of the walls of thunder that no man could cross. Diaries recovered from the caves of Tinian and Guam told of soldiers digging deeper, determined never again to charge across open ground. One officer wrote, "The Americans do not fight men. They fight with machines that never sleep." When the Imperial General Staff reviewed the Saipan disaster, the conclusion was reluctant but inevitable. The doctrine of the offensive, once Japan's greatest pride, was now suicide. No amount of training or spirit could stop the mechanical symphony of American firepower. Yet, even as Japanese command accepted this, they did not surrender the ideology behind it. They turned it skyward, transmuting the Banzai spirit into aerial suicide attacks. Young pilots trading ground charges for final dives. In that transformation, the ghost of the Banzai charge lived on, reshaped by desperation. Saipan, therefore, was not just another battle. It was a requiem for an age. The night courage met circuitry and equations, and one of them vanished. In the months following Saipan, the ripples of that night reached far beyond the Pacific. Intelligence officers in Tokyo read the reports with disbelief. Even as they censored the scale of the loss from the public, senior generals understood what it meant. The Imperial Army's offensive doctrine, the spiritual foundation of its identity, had been shattered. The charge, once celebrated in propaganda films and textbooks, vanished from Japanese manuals almost overnight. Field regulations quietly replaced offensive spirit with tenacious defense. On the next islands, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Japanese troops no longer sprinted through flares and machine gun fire. They disappeared underground. The new order was simple: dig, endure, and die where you stand. It was a tragic evolution born of necessity. If open ground was death, then the earth itself became their armor. Entire regiments carved bunkers into volcanic rock, constructing layered tunnel networks that forced Americans to fight 1 yard at a time. The sound of 81mm mortars echoing through the jungle gave way to flamethrowers and demolition charges exploding in caves. The battlefield had shifted from open slaughter to suffocating siege. For American units, the change was psychological. The victory at Saipan, like Edson's Ridge before it, proved their doctrine, but it also revealed its price. Machine gun and mortar crews who had survived the Banzai charges often carried those nights with them for life. "You never forget the sound," one veteran said. "It's not just the gunfire, it's the silence after." War correspondents, too, noticed the transformation. Reporters who followed the Marines from Guadalcanal to Okinawa observed that the soldiers had become quieter, more mechanical. They no longer cheered after repelling an attack. They simply reloaded, rechecked angles, and prepared for the next. The battlefield had stripped emotion away and replaced it with rhythm, a rhythm taught by the beat of the Brownings and the pulse of the mortars. Strategically, Saipan's fall had immense consequences. It gave the United States a base within 1,500 miles of Tokyo, placing Japan within reach of B-29 bombers. From that moment forward, the war's direction was irreversible. The empire that had conquered half the Pacific now found itself cornered, its fleets shattered, its airfields burning, its armies reduced to garrisons awaiting annihilation. And yet, even in defeat, Japanese leaders clung to the ideal that had driven those charges: death before surrender. That same ethos would fuel the final desperate years of the war: kamikaze pilots diving into carriers, soldiers refusing to lay down arms long after defeat became certain. The spirit that once rushed across the Tanaru now fell from the sky in fire. Historians later viewed Guadalcanal and Saipan as mirror images, the opening and closing verses of a single grim symphony. At the Tanaru, Japanese officers had believed courage could conquer calculation. At Saipan, they learned that courage alone could no longer exist on a modern battlefield. Between those 2 points lay every island in between, every ridge, beachhead, and jungle where men discovered that bravery without balance was simply a way to die faster. When peace finally came in 1945, American soldiers returning home spoke less of victory than survival. They didn't boast of marksmanship or heroism. They spoke of geometry, of arcs, bearings, angles, and timing. The men who had once stared down Banzai charges understood something profound: that in the age of mortars and machine guns, war had become less about who dared, more and more about who measured better. In a sense, Saipan marked the end of human war as the world had known it. From that coral island onward, battles would be won not by the individual spirit, but by the system's efficiency, by the cold synchronization of firepower, logistics, and mathematics. And for the Japanese infantry who once believed the heart could defy the bullet, that realization came not through surrender, but through silence, the kind that falls after the last flare fades, when even the bravest discover that courage cannot outpace the speed of steel. In the long shadow of the Pacific War, the story of the Japanese infantry charge and the American response stands as more than a record of tactics. It is a portrait of transformation. 2 worlds met on those islands, one shaped by centuries of warrior tradition, the other by the relentless logic of industrial warfare. And between them lay the future of combat. The Japanese soldier who ran through the flares at Guadalcanal carried with him a code older than the empire itself. He believed that courage could bend destiny, that spirit could outlast metal. The American waiting behind the .50 caliber Browning believed something very different, that precision, discipline, and cooperation could make courage unnecessary. When those beliefs collided, the outcome was inevitable. The 81 mm mortar and the Browning M2 became symbols of that new world. Not just weapons, but instruments of an age where victory no longer belonged to the bravest, but to the best organized. They turned the battlefield into a machine, predictable, repeatable, unstoppable. The individual was reduced to a role in a system, his survival tied to mathematics instead of willpower. Yet there was tragedy on both sides. The Japanese infantry who died charging across Saipan were not fools. They were men shaped by a belief that had once won empires. Their defeat did not come from weakness, but from the arrival of a world that no longer had room for that kind of faith. The Americans, for all their triumph, carried scars of a different kind, the weight of having witnessed courage crushed beneath arithmetic. After Guadalcanal, after Saipan, many no longer saw war as glory but as calculation. The lesson was bitter, but lasting. By the time the Pacific fell silent in 1945, one truth had become clear. The age of valor had ended, and the age of velocity had begun. The world had crossed a threshold, from men who charged into gunfire to men who calculated its trajectory. And in that crossing, the very meaning of war changed forever.